Good afternoon, or morning, one of those. Welcome to all of you, both here and then also online. My name is Shannon Kirshner, and I am one of the pastors here at Fourth Church. What do I need to do? Awkward. It is my honor to introduce our speaker today, Ms. Natalie Moore. Ms. Moore grew up on the south side of Chicago and continues to reside in that part of our city in Hyde Park. She also grew up in the Presbyterian Church, so we lay claim. You might know her best from her work with WBEZ, where she's been since 2007, diligently covering issues of segregation, race, housing, economic development, food insecurity, and violence. Or you might know her best from her book, South Side, that came out in 2016, that also won the 2016 Chicago Review of Books, as well as BuzzFeed's Best Nonfiction Book of 2016. She's also the co-author of The Almighty Black Stone Nation. Ms. Moore's work has been published in just a few places: Essence, Ebony, The Chicago Reporter, Chicago Tribune, The New York Times, Washington Post, and The Guardian, and I know I've left out a few, and that doesn't even count her monthly column for the Chicago Sun-Times. Ms. Moore has received numerous accolades, but one that really stood out to me, since we're hearing her perspective today, is the Studs Terkel Community Media Award for reporting on Chicago's diverse neighborhoods, and she was awarded that in 2010. She received her BA in journalism from Howard University, followed by an MSJ from Medill School of Journalism at Northwestern. The Pulitzer Center just named her in 2020 a Richard C. Longworth Media Fellow for her international reporting, and just last year, in 2021, she was named as a Senior Practitioner Fellow at the University of Chicago Center for Effective Government. Ms. Moore has been with us here before at Fourth Church, and we sure hope that today will not be her last time with us. We are thankful for the myriad of ways she contributes to the public good and to these larger, messy, and critical conversations like we are having today. So one last thing, as Cynthia's already mentioned, please save your questions for the end of her presentation, and she will address them at that point. So again, without any further ado, Natalie Moore.
Okay, trying to make sure that the folks can see me okay. All right, well, good morning. Thank you for having me back, and greetings from Currar Church on 81st and Calumet. As Shannon said, I have been here numerous times, and thank you for that introduction. Even though I'm not talking about the book directly, The South Side, today, one thing that I wanted to share with you all is one of the surprises that came out of the book, and you know, my work in general. So people often ask, who's your audience? Who are you thinking about when you are writing your book? And I say no one. I don't want to embarrass people in my community, of course, but I say that when you start thinking about your audience, you start adapting, and you may not be as authentic as you should be. And I also teach writing to graduate students, and I tell them that as well. So one of the surprises in writing when the book came out is how many churches reached out to me. And I would have never put that on my bingo checklist card of here is an audience that I really want to make sure that I captured, and I have loved that I've captured it. I've spoken to all sorts of churches, obviously Fourth, small Black community churches, big Black mega churches, integrated churches, downtown churches, LGBTQ churches, and there's been this desire for learning more about social justice, and so I'm happy to you know, a lot of church folks have a bad rep, understandably so, by some of the things that we see in public display. But there's also this other side of Christian folk who are trying to do better and trying to learn and marry the mission of social justice with the gospel. So that makes me very happy to speak to audiences like you all. So the basic premise of my work is that segregation undermines Chicago from truly being the world-class city that we can be. And I've come to that conclusion. Well, one, being segregated in Chicago and in the region is like air and water. It's something that you don't think about. It just is, and we have long accepted that. It hasn't been taught, this ugly racist housing history. And I would say in the past 10 years, 8 to 10 years, that has changed in the public sphere from, I think, local journalists here at WBEZ, as well as some high-profile national journalists. In books that have come out. I'm sure a number of you have read Richard Rothstein's book, The Color of Law, and we're here as part of a 1619 series. So that gives me some hope that once we understand our history, maybe we can make some changes. So one thing that when I was writing The South Side, there are moments when you wonder, even though I've talked about audience, am I stating the obvious? Or like, do Chicago people know this only? Do folks on the national level know this? And I found that really across the board, a lot of people didn't know the story about Lorraine Hansberry and how A Raisin in the Sun was really based a lot on her own family experience. They were living in the overcrowded Black Belt. Carl Hansberry sought to buy a home in West Woodlawn, which was all white, and was protected by a restrictive covenant. Well, that case went to the Supreme Court because, and the Hansberrys won, not because of racial justice, but because not enough white people had signed the petition. And I have long wondered how many covenants were in the Chicago region. What is that history there? We know that the 1948 case, Shelley versus Kramer, made them unenforceable, and then you had the 1968 Fair Housing Act that outlawed them. And there was so much white flight that happened, not just in Chicago, but in cities around the country, where if you look at the census numbers in 1940 to 1950 to 1960, you see 99% white to 99% black. And again, air and water. I knew that my neighborhood, Chatham, was all black and that white people lived there, but I didn't really understand why I didn't have that language. Several years ago, there was a Twitter conversation about how do you find these covenants? And it is really, really hard. And it went nowhere.
So I'm really sorry to interrupt,
that's okay.
but your notes are showing up on screen. Now it's perfect.
Oh, I didn't know the screen was sharing.
That's perfect, thank you.
Okay.
I'm so sorry,
Thank you.
We want to hear you, but people get distracted, we want to see your face. So
Yeah, and I don't want you all reading ahead of my notes. I could just go home now, shut the laptop. Thank you, and I should have been looking behind me. I was like, oh, I'm not sharing screen. They're not gonna see that. So that went nowhere, but last year, the NPR investigative team said, we want to assemble a team of journalists from member stations around the country to look in their own cities and find out about restrictive covenants. And the historian who I had been in touch with many years ago on Twitter, I reached out to him and said, how do we do this? So that's a little bit of the setup. So we ended up doing, it took from February to November for the stories to come out and for the research. So we did a team national story, and then I did 2 local stories about what I found. And I want to play that audio, and then I want to open it up. I promise to leave plenty of time for questions, because that's always the most exciting part.
The Chicago region today is shaped by racial segregation of the past. Before redlining, which denied Black people home mortgages, there were racially restricted deeds and covenants. They were legal methods that white homeowners used a century ago to resist integration as tens of thousands of black Southerners started moving to Chicago. This spring, WBEZ asked the public to comb through old family property records to find restrictive documents. The WBEZ's Natalie Moore also combed through county property records and found her own personal connection to such language. She has the first of two stories.
90 years ago, I could not have lived in my apartment because of my skin color, unless I was a janitor, chauffeur, or house servant.
The restriction that no part of said premises shall in any manner be used or occupied directly or indirectly by any Negro or Negroes.
I live in a beautiful brick walk-up building in the lakefront Chicago Hyde Park neighborhood. We're on the top floor. Our 3,000 square foot apartment floods with light from a sunroom in the front and one in the back. Apparently, the current dining room used to be the maid's quarters, right off the hall bathroom.
Provided this restriction shall not prevent the occupation during the period of their employment of janitors or chauffeurs' quarters in the basement or in a barn or garage in the rear.
Today, the neighborhood is lauded as a bastion of intellectualism and integration, but some Hyde Parkers played an ugly role in an ugly part of Chicago's housing history. Back then, Hyde Park feared a black invasion given its proximity to the Black Belt, but Hyde Park was whiter, wealthier, and home to the University of Chicago, with resources to keep black residents out. My home was one of many addresses covered by a covenant, which often includes several blocks of properties. The document contains several pages of signatures from property owners. As a race reporter, I knew these covenants existed, but seeing an actual document proved more jarring than I thought. That evening, anger washed over me when I cooked dinner. I stood in my kitchen knowing the only way I could have occupied that space decades ago was if I were cooking for a white family. My lived experience of Chicago segregation jumped to another level. I found racial restrictive covenants like this in the basement of the Cook County Clerk's office. The multi-step process is laborious because the records aren't digitized. It's a masterclass in unraveling red tape. You pore over several thick property books, search filing cabinets, and comb through handwritten ledgers before maybe landing on keywords such as race restrictions. You fill out slips of paper with documented page numbers to possibly get to microfilm or a request for documents from the warehouse. I spent 5 hours on my address alone. Racially restrictive deeds and covenants were prevalent in the Chicago area up until 1948. That's when the U.S. Supreme Court ruled them unenforceable.
The way that covenants came to dominate and were used in the first half of the 20th century was as a result of real estate developers' work in cities that were facing new arrivals from the Great Migration.
That's historian Liddell Windling, who teaches at Virginia Tech University. He is writing a book on various racist real estate practices. He is also a fellow at Newberry Library, which is preserving the documents we found ourselves and from the WBEZ public call-out. A century ago, when Black Southerners migrated to Chicago, they were confined to the Black Belt. Many migrated from the South to escape violence, but Jim Crow of the North welcomed them. Wendling refers to covenants as a bloodless legal mechanism. Living in aging, dilapidated, or fire-gutted housing meant rats and infestation. Families paid too much, faced deplorable conditions. After the 1919 race riots, a commission report said, "Don't segregate housing in the city." The opposite happened. As home to the headquarters for the National Association for Real Estate Boards, Chicago wielded influence.
This was kind of a clearinghouse for ideas, or like a nerve center for both centralizing and accumulating ideas about real estate practice and then sending them out to individual boards and chapters throughout the country.
In 1917, the U.S. Supreme Court ruled that local governments could not explicitly create racial zones like in apartheid South Africa. But another Supreme Court case a decade later upheld restrictive covenants on properties. The National Real Estate Board's General Counsel in Chicago created a covenant template with this message to real estate agents and developers.
You should use this template in your community, wherever you are: Peoria, Wichita, Spokane, Tacoma, San Francisco, Philadelphia. And so we see a standardization and then intensification of the use of covenants after 1926 and then 1927 when a model covenant is created.
Millions of covenants were attached to properties across the United States. It's nearly impossible to quantify exactly how many of these legally binding documents cover the Chicago area. White neighborhood associations organized in favor of them, and property owners often paid $5 to sign their name to the covenants. Scholars say in the 1940s, more than 220 subdivisions in Cook County created or adopted covenants. African Americans did not accept second-class citizenry. Carl Hansberry won a U.S. Supreme Court case in 1940 when his family bought a home in the white West Woodlawn neighborhood. A white neighbor named Natalie objected. The Hansberrys prevailed, but only on a technicality. Not enough white people signed the covenant. I also found those documents in the basement of the county clerk's office. Daughter Lorraine Hansberry was 8 years old when the family moved there. The experience informed her seminal play, A Raisin in the Sun, about a Black Chicago family seeking to move to a white neighborhood and being met with resistance from white neighbors.
It's a matter of the people of Clybourne Park believing, now rightly or wrongly as I say, that for the happiness of all concerned, that our Negro families are happier when they live in their own communities. This, friends, is the welcoming committee.
Is this what you came marching all the way over here to tell us?
Meanwhile, lawyers and civil rights groups argued covenants were not simple private contracts, but a tool to uphold segregation, a social evil. In 1945, the NAACP convened a restrictive covenants conference in Chicago with attorneys from all over the country. FBI Director J. Edgar Hoover labeled at least one of the prominent Negro lawyers a communist. This two-day summit took place not too long after my landlord, Mr. Williams, moved to Chicago. Good morning. Thank you. I wanted to talk to him about the covenant on his building. A quiet, elegant man, Mr. Williams is a retired school administrator who blasts jazz and classical music the way I blast 90s hip-hop 2 levels above. He didn't know the building he bought in 1971 had a covenant. But what I learned was much more striking. Mr. Williams is emblematic of the Great Migration and a victim of racist housing policies.
We moved here from Alabama. My mother came here first because of employment.
She came here to work at a tank factory during World War II on a site that's now Ford City. Mr. Williams joined her when he was about 8 years old. Along with his father, the family lived in the Black Belt in a one-room kitchenette apartment. The neighborhood was so cramped, so landlords cut up buildings into tiny apartments to accommodate newcomers.
We slept and we ate and cooked in one room.
But when Mr. Williams was in high school, the family moved.
My mother bought her first property. We bought a 2-flat in what is now called Park Manor.
In 1948, the U.S. Supreme Court ruled that covenants were unenforceable, opening up a host of white Southside neighborhoods like Park Manor to Black families. The fall of covenants led to white flight. Some neighborhoods turned from nearly all white to nearly all Black in the span of a decade. Mr. Williams says decades later, after his mother died, he found paperwork indicating the home was covered by a racial covenant.
You all moved to that block. Were there any white neighbors?
There were a few, but they were leaving as fast as they could get out.
How quickly did they leave?
To the point I would almost say that I don't remember them being there.
Park Manor is special to me. The WBEZ Southside Bureau is located there on 75th Street. My grandparents bought a 2-flat in the neighborhood on 72nd and Prairie in 1980. On one of my visits to Cook County, I found a covenant that covered both of these properties. But I'm not the only WBEZ staffer who found a personal connection to covenants in the Cook County basement.
But yeah, this is wild.
That's my editor, Alden Laurie. He runs a Greystone with beautiful interior woodwork, not far from me in the North Kenwood neighborhood. Alden discovered a covenant on that property, and with the data whiz, he looked up the owners using census records.
They were an immigrant from the Netherlands, I want to say, and she was married to a gentleman who was also an immigrant from Europe. They had children. They lived here in 1930.
We'll never know if the family understood they signed on a dotted line that included a restrictive covenant, but many immigrants from Europe did that, and that was their path to gaining whiteness not only in Chicago, but in the US. Alden has a similar reaction to the covenants as I did.
From the rationale, the thinking, the emotion that must have been present during those times to say this is something that we should do, seeing that language really made that stuff tangible for me.
Researching covenants has given Alden a greater respect for what his great-grandparents endured migrating to Chicago decades ago.
They endured that, they survived it, and in some cases even thrived. I just think is just really incredible given what they were facing and the barriers and restrictions that they were up against. So the connections are, even in acknowledging in a space where you feel like you're doing relatively well, all things considered, but still acknowledging how incredibly hard it is and thinking like it was even harder for folks, some decades ago.
The once white census tracts that Alden and I live in today are much more diverse with Black residents. We were able to choose where we rent without the same barriers Black Chicagoans once faced. And while the covenants are a vestige of the past, coming face to face with their language offers a sobering reminder of Chicago's long-lasting legacy of racial discrimination and the pain it still evokes.
This spring, WBEZ asked the public to check paperwork on old family properties for racially restrictive deeds and covenants. Until 1948, these documents prevented the sale or rental of properties to anyone Black or non-Caucasian, and they spread all over Chicago's South Side to prevent integration. 19 people submitted records to WBEZ, and most came from unexpected parts of the region. Here's WBEZ's Natalie Moore with part 2 of our series on restrictive covenants.
Premises shall not be sold, leased, or conveyed to persons of African blood.
Dave Wagner reads a line from a 1926 restrictive deed on his North Suburban Highland Park home. He didn't know it existed when he and his wife bought the home in 1983. Wagner, who was white and a retired architect, worked in the northern suburbs at the time. Highland Park's good schools and proximity to the lake attracted the couple.
When we were looking for houses, we stumbled across this listing for what was at the time this tiny little house. One of the things that attracted to us was it was one of the cheapest things we could find. My wife and I were just a couple years out of college, and we had enough for maybe a down payment.
Run down in 700 square feet, they saw potential in the home. 4 years later, the couple refinanced and made a discovery while digging for paperwork.
I found a copy of the title policy and started reading it, and at that point I noticed that it had what I've come to understand are a racial deed restriction.
He was floored and offended and reached out to a lawyer.
He said, I don't think you need to worry about it. And I said, well, but it bugs me. How do I take it away?
Turns out it's not that easy, but I'll get to that later. His home's restrictive deed was written in 1926 when nary a Black person lived in the suburb. In 1930, Highland Park's Black population was 1.5%. Restrictive deeds and covenants were used all over the country to keep Black people out of white communities. In Chicago, Black residents were confined to the Black Belt in slums and overcrowded housing conditions. Nearby white homeowners responded with fear and used these binding legal agreements to preserve the whiteness of their neighborhoods. I was surprised that Highland Park and other suburbs used the tool as well, in an era before white flight, before the interstate highway system was built that rolled out the red carpet to white suburbs. Black Southerners who ventured to Chicago during the Great Migration did not seek to settle on the North Shore, yet covenants existed there.
It's about comforting potential homebuyers or assuring them, even though it's clear no African Americans live here now, we're guaranteeing you they won't live here in the future.
Dale Wendling is a professor at Virginia Tech University who studies racial housing discrimination. As a fellow at Newberry Library, he's helping WBEZ gather the covenants for preservation there. Wendling found that many early 20th century housing developers advertised in Chicago newspapers promoting their new homes in the city and suburbs. In the 1920s, many of those ads labeled the developments as restrictive. It was a bragging right, the way an ensuite bathroom is today in a real estate listing. Desmond Otagu and his students at Lake Forest College located local suburban plaques with restrictive covenants and put them all online for a public digital project. By the 1940s, there were 220 subdivisions in Cook County with restrictive covenants.
If you look at the legal history of racial restrictions and the way it coincides with the Great Migration, and then look at the publicity campaign that came with that, it was fairly clear to me that there are many parts of the country that, although they didn't have a lot of, black folks, were already being sensitized about the supposed threat of having these people who are coming to their neighborhood.
Otagu connects the racist covenants to the housing landscape today and the black-white racial wealth gap. But Otagu, who is Nigerian, says he is also connecting this history to the larger history of global imperialism.
Chicago or the US is not unique when it comes to the use of land, displacement, and dispossession as a tool in the exercise of power.
And racist housing policies remain even without the use of covenants. Many white and wealthy suburbs in the region still fight to keep the racial and economic homogeneity of their communities, not with deeds, but exclusionary zoning to keep affordable housing out. Today, Glenview has a 6-figure median income and a 1.5% black population. It too had racial restrictions. Doug McCarthy's parents bought a home in Glenview in 1967, and he saw the certificate for the title 30 years later. He pulls it out for me when we meet at the local library.
And on the back it has what it calls memorials of estates and easements, encumbrances, and charges on the land. And one of them describes that the residential purposes for the land can only be used for people of the Caucasian race, servants accepted.
Even though the U.S. Supreme Court ruled that covenants were unenforceable 2 decades earlier, that didn't prohibit them. The 1968 Fair Housing Act made the restrictions illegal. McCarthy says he doesn't know if his parents knew about the covenant when they bought the home, but when the family saw it years later, everyone was surprised. His parents are deceased, and McCarthy uploaded the document to WBEZ, but he has questions about whether his mother removed the racist language.
If there any chance at being able to get rid of it, she would have gotten rid of it. Emotionally, it makes me a little sad to think that this has happened so recently. All I can think of is we need to work to make sure that language like this gets taken out.
But restrictive deeds have not been easy to get rid of. Dave Woodgardner tried for his Highland Park home decades ago. He eventually dropped the matter. Children were born, additions were added to the house, and it transformed into an arts and craftsman style with huge bay windows in the dining room that looks out onto a park next door.
Knowing that the restriction was here bothered me, but I wasn't sure how to deal with or grapple with it. It just felt wrong. It's just like, this can't be. And it hit me at an emotional level in that way. Clearly over the years, not enough that I became an activist sooner.
But he is much more attuned to such matters. He volunteers in local community development issues and joined the local housing commission, backing subsidized and affordable housing in Highland Park, where the median income is $150,000. And even without covenants, the suburb looks eerily similar to what it looked like nearly a century ago when the race restriction was placed on the deed to Woodgardner's home. Today, Highland Park's black population is just 0.8%, even less than it was back in 1930. The suburb's most famous black resident was Michael Jordan. In recent years, Woodgardner has read groundbreaking work from journalists and scholars on housing segregation. He listened to Englewood artist and activist Tanika Johnson talk about her Voted Map series, which pairs black Chicagoans from the city's south side with white counterparts who share the same house number and street, but on the city's north side. When Woodgardner's wife told him about the WBEZ public call-out on restrictive deeds, he readily submitted.
And I suppose if it was removed, it doesn't change the conversation. Like is the wrong word, but I think you'll understand what I mean. I like the fact that I can say there's this awful thing.
After we talked, Governor J.B. Pritzker signed a bill that in January will allow homeowners to remove racist language from property deeds. Woodgardner says he and his wife will remove it from theirs, but they won't stop talking about the racist deed or the need to continue fighting segregation. Natalie Moore, WBEZ News.
Okay, so a couple of things. I'm going to put my email in the chat. We are still taking uploads, so anyone who lives in a house that was built before 1968 or has a family who did, you might want to look through your records. And also Ladale Wendling, who was in both stories, has assembled 100 volunteers to go down into the Cook County basement. He's continuing to do this work and is writing a book. So if anyone wants to volunteer, I'm sure he would love to have you. And the end of that story also mentioned that there was a new law that was going to take effect. The story aired in November, and yes, the new law means that you can get it removed for $10. So I have a story about that on WBEZ, and the audio will air next week. So you can go to your Cook County, you can go to your local recorder of deeds. It's a streamlined, fast process, and you can get that language removed. So some of the notes that I had up were actually from an email. I would say overall, the response that I've gotten from people has been, I would say positive, and people feeling like we need to have this reckoning with the records. And even in the story that I did about these being removed, I have been in contact with people who have uploaded or who, after they heard the story, decided they wanted to look into it, and really looking into it on a lark, and then realizing, oh my gosh, my parents had a house that had these documents. How do I feel about that? My parents obviously saw this language. But one email really bothered me, and it's a critique that I get of my work from time to time from white consumers who want to argue with me that this is a class issue and not a race issue. Now, I don't know what you heard in that piece that makes you think that this was often race and class go hand in hand. But you could be a wealthy white person, a wealthy black person, and still not live in these communities. And the person accused me of also only focusing too much on black people, that there were other groups who were excluded. And you would have heard from the story that there were times it was said, no one of non-Caucasian. I didn't do a cover-up of my story. I found what I found. Most of the documents said Negro, and it is true that there were other exclusionary language, and particularly in other parts of the country, that might have said no Jewish people allowed. Someone in California said that they said no Armenians allowed. But to try to characterize this as only that I'm overblowing the black issue, given what we know also about race and housing, was really difficult. And it angered me, and I forwarded it to a lot of friends who cover race, the historian. So I'll just read a little bit of it. I have to say, in defense of the truth, that too much emphasis, not only in your article but elsewhere, is placed exclusively on Black Americans being legally excluded from certain neighborhoods. It's inaccurate to frame the issue as blacks versus whites. Although you focus on language and covenants that specifically identifies blacks under other covenants that weren't uniform, the signer agreed not to sell, rent, or lease the property in question to other minority groups, usually blacks, but sometimes Jews, Chinese, Japanese, Mexicans, Armenians, Persians, or Syrians. You must have come across those in your research. Why didn't you point that out for the sake of accuracy? Although covenants are painted in articles like yours with the same big brush as races at the heart, they are primarily about, as you mentioned, economics and community culture. Even in Bronzeville, homeowners did not want their property values to plunge because of newcomers arriving as part of the Great Migration. They simply have no use for grass, a disgusted Bronzeville homeowner said. Then he goes on and talks about Carl Hansberry being a slumlord. And then says, there's a much bigger story here than white people being too sunk in prejudice to know wrong from right. The truth about property covenants involves class, capitalism, the American dream, and the importance of community culture in holding neighborhoods together. In 2015, Spike Lee admonished white New Yorkers, you just can't come in Fort Greene, I'm for democracy and letting everybody live, but you got to have some respect. You just can't come in when people have a culture that's been laid down for generations. I won't say all the curse words. A Polish American in Pulaski Park who worked in the steel mill to pay his mortgage ordered a kielbasa at his favorite local restaurant and attended St. Stanislaus Kostka Church. Couldn't have said it better. And so he signed the deed on his house with the boilerplate language, restrictive covenant attached, gratefully. I didn't mean to call out the person who said this. I didn't respond to him because I thought he was beneath me and I wanted to protect my peace. I get a lot of awful emails. His argument was beneath me. I get a lot of horrible messages on Twitter and on email, and there is a particular harassment that Black female journalists face, and I decided that I wasn't going to respond to him. And I think that there is, and conversely, one time I got an email from someone in Canada who said that my book should have focused on class and went off on me about it. And we had an exchange that was, he was very insulting. And there seems to be a particular comfort level among some white people that if we just talk about it from a class perspective, then it's okay. And I'm not saying that we shouldn't have class conversations, but there is something, I'm not going to talk about what goes on in Canada because I'm not an expert there. And so for him to, and then he also told me I was an elite like Oprah and the Obamas. He obviously doesn't know what public radio journalists make. I was also the reason that Bernie Sanders lost. So I'm telling you absurd things. But there is a certain comfort level that people have, and class conversations are important and necessary, and I don't want to diminish that, but we can't use class as a proxy for race. So I just wanted to share some of that pushback that people give, because I think it makes them feel better about themselves. Well, if my ancestor or a great-grandparent did this, it was because of class. It wasn't because they were racist. And there's an aversion, some white people, they just think the worst thing you can be called is racist or racist policy. And it's not about what's in your heart, it's about what you signed, it's about a bigger systemic issue. And even with my editor, Alden, saying that those were Swedish immigrants who signed, they may not have known, they may not have understand the structure of housing and race in this country, but those kind of documents also led white ethnic immigrants along the path to gaining whiteness in their country. And that has to be a part of the conversation too. So with that, I'm going to turn it over to questions. I have a couple in the chat that I'll start out with first. How do we talk with those people who have, to my mind, adopted fully the lies of T and his minions? I'm sure that's Trump. One thing that I have been saying over the past several years is that white people have to talk to other white people. And people may be more likely to listen to their own family members or people who they know rather than me. Or Dave Wood-Gardner in Highland Park, how he says, I talk about this with my friends and my neighbors. I bring up this history. It can't always be incumbent upon Black people or other people of color to try to do this explaining. So that's, we are unfortunately in a crisis of democracy right now where people believe things are a lie if they don't agree with it. So it is I think we are in very difficult times right now, but my short answer is that, white people have to do some of this work. And I'll toggle back and forth between online and here. Burl Satter, 20 to 30 years ago, wrote about her family and properties and restrictive covenants, which I read when it was released, recommend to all who want to learn about this issue. And that book is called Family Properties, and it's about the West Side, and it's about, she talks a lot about contract buying. So African Americans who thought they were buying a home, they really weren't. Somebody white held the deed and it plundered wealth. And there's been research that has come out that has said Black Chicagoans lost between $3 and $4 billion worth of wealth because of contract buying in the city. Knox Presbyterian Church in Cincinnati found a document which accepted a large donation from a family over 100 years ago that premised the gift on keeping the church all white. The current session and members of the church were shocked. No one knew about this in the current congregation. So they spent several weeks looking into and talking about why such a covenant was attached to the gift. I hope that church is open and talks about it with the presbytery, with the Cincinnati community. These type of things shouldn't be hidden. The current people are not responsible for it, but they do have a responsibility, I believe, to talk about it and find ways to rectify some of that harm. This is a terrible part of our history. Curious to know whether any courts have enforced race-based deed covenants since 1948. Not that I know of. What do we say to white people who buy into the lies, who are afraid of the coming demographic change, though I believe it goes deeper than that? Yeah, I keep trying to share the truth and work with young people so they don't become adults who believe these type of lies. Any questions from the audience? Or any reaction, if you don't have a question, if you want to share your feelings.
Yes.
I was just curious, in your opinion, what's the best way to frame an argument with someone who, when they hear about these racist covenants, respond with, that was them and this is now, we don't have those anymore. What's the best way to respond to someone who might interpret those racist covenants as history and not a legacy of that racial identity?
Well, I would say that, oh, yes. The question was, how do you deal with people who say that is the past? That was then, this is now. There are other people who have much more eloquent answers to that, and I wish I could quote them right now, remember, but even though it is the past, we still benefit in this country. We still share things in this country, whether it's good things like a system that provides public libraries, even if you don't use them. But if you live in a neighborhood, there has to be some reconciliation about how this system was set up to benefit people like you and also exclude others. So it's not about personal responsibility for that person to say, well, I feel guilty. But I didn't do this. It's more about understanding the structures and the system and how to go forward with making sure these type of things don't happen again, and acknowledging that there is privilege that exists when you have a system that was created that way. And systems are so big, they don't always, if that person didn't benefit individually, there usually is some sort of tangential benefit. I saw a hand over. Yeah. Let me take this, a couple of questions from the audience first, since I've done a lot online. Yes.
I don't know if it's a question or not. It's more of a statement. In a way, I understand why churches are coming to you, and I feel very blessed that I could cry when I talk about this. So I grew up on the West Side. I lived there, like during the riots and Martin Luther King, and I couldn't understand, why all this stuff was happening. And I really want to thank you for doing the work, and I have read Family Properties, And it helped me to clarify at that time. It was very hard to understand, what was going on. And so I'm just very thankful for you, and not only for the confusion, which I learned about and chose to educate myself as to what happened, but when you're talking about, prior even to that, all these covenants and all these things that I didn't know about. And I think we have to teach our young people. Our school system is not helping us to heal, to educate, to tell the truth. And that's where I think churches come in, that people can be innocent and not know things. But, I love what Gandhi said one time, and I'll say this because I'm in a Christian church. He was asked, what do you think of the Christian religion? And his response was, it's a great religion if they would only practice it. And I think that's what we're learning more and more, that we have responsibility. That's it. That's all I have to say.
you.
Thank you.
To the online audience, it wasn't a question, it was, she talked a lot about the work that the church needs to do and how the church can maybe fill in gaps where education is not teaching this type of work, this type of history. Yes.
It's great that the governor made it legal to remove the covenant, because the covenant doesn't have to be legal to make it threatening. And they were certainly very effective long after they were unenforceable, which is truly a pleasant intent for those who put it in there. They can say, well, you can ignore it, but it still has its effect.
Yeah, he was saying that it's great that the governor passed this law, and that the backstory with that is there was a woman in Mundelein who lives, a homeowner who's part of an association, and she wanted to change some fencing on her property. And when she saw the documents, she saw that it was a restrictive covenant. And so she was told it was too expensive to change, she couldn't do it, so she went to her state senator, Adrian Johnson, and was able to get this law passed. And, it's really important to note how some of these suburban communities that had these covenants were all white then and how white they are now. And why she wanted to change it is that she felt it was harmful to some of the people of color who may live there. I mean, it's still in those documents. And when you're looking to change a fence, this is what you see along the way. So even if they aren't enforceable, there's still harm. I'm going to read a couple of comments. And Maggie says, like you said in the response to the Cincinnati example, talking about these parts of our history is critical. Our institutional racism is so deep and wide. I don't think most people, white or otherwise, have any idea how implicit bias is built into our mental models. People in this country don't think in terms of systems, they think in terms of rugged individualism. Yeah, I would agree with that. I live in Florida and there is no mask mandate. I think that if early on in the pandemic we had been told that wearing a mask will help prevent us from getting COVID, there would be more masks. People are out for themselves and not the other person. That also underlies these issues.
Natalie, Cynthia Castile has her hand up.
Okay.
Natalie, thank you for your great presentation. I wanted to echo that racism is still a problem. I'm thinking of Texas, where I grew up and still have many friends and relatives. In the last few years, the demographics there have been changing, and the state is soon to reach a tipping point where people of color may actually represent a substantial voting bloc. How interesting that now the state legislature and the governor have enacted very strict voting regulations such that many of the voting applications have been disqualified. Certainly, one cannot argue that this is an economic problem. Would you like to comment on the issue with voting rights and some of the issues with voting restrictions coming up across the nation?
I am not well versed enough from a reporting perspective to talk about it. Although this morning at 7:30, as I was cooking breakfast, I tuned into Trinity United Church of Christ service, and Reverend Moss has been doing a hunger strike, and he was telling the congregation to flood the phone lines, the switchboard in Congress. The goal for him is that it makes the news that the switchboard was shut down because people were calling, demanding that this bill be passed. Yes, you in the sweater.
I basically have a comment. One of the fallouts from these restrictive covenants is that when Black people drive through those communities, police officers stop them in many instances asking them, what are you doing here? And so what they tend to do is increase the kind of barriers that Black people have just in terms of egress, moving through communities. And I know that in Highland Park, where Michael Jordan lived, there were a number of very famous and very rich basketball players who were stopped by the Highland Park police simply because they were driving in Black in Highland Park.
Yeah, and she talks about driving while Black in some of these white suburbs. And how the police will pull you over. I saw a couple other hands back here. Yeah.
Hi, Ms. Moore. I'm a fellow Southsider and born and raised in the Morgan Park neighborhood. And in fact, my grandparents had a home, 2 flats that they had in Grand Crossing, so not too far, I think, from where at least the reporting you mentioned your grandparents had a home too. Just want to thank you for your work and the way in which it has really opened up in multiple dimensions the stories of Black people in particular on the South Side. So I've gotten a 360 on my family's history, on my community's history that I did not have beforehand. I'm interested in your thoughts on...
Is there anything I can do about the feedback? Is that me? When I started talking, it went away.
I'm interested in your thoughts on the out-migration of African Americans in Chicago right now, and how that tracks with the in-migration, with the great migrations that came through here, and the restrictions that shaped our migrations within and throughout the Chicagoland area, and now are, what are those restrictions or challenges that are pushing Black folk out of Chicago?
Yeah. Thank you. And I went to Morgan Park High School. So the question was, what do I think about Black people who are leaving the city of Chicago? So one of my issues with the narrative about population loss is that it has become really politicized, and it's talked about as if this is recent. The numbers, the Black population was at its peak in 1980, and it's been declining ever since. But it tends to be a political when you start talking about it. Black people are leaving because of violence. And no matter where you are politically, like that becomes the only narrative, as if what's happening right now is driving people out, or that's the only thing that is driving people out. And that is not really an accurate, and those kind of comments really aren't about uplifting these communities, it's more about finger pointing. So you have to really look at the trend long term to understand. So some of the reasons, some Black people want to live in the suburbs like other races. That's part of the American dream. My husband would have been part of the 200,000 decline between 2000 and 2010. He was married to his first wife at the time, and they built a house in Flossmoor because they wanted their children to go to the schools there. He is now back in the city because I'm not going to live in Flossmoor. So there are, sometimes we talk about it just in terms of low income people being pushed out, but there are tons of middle class people who have left, and we also have seen diversity grow in a number of suburbs. So I don't think that that's taken into account, but the University of Illinois at Chicago has been doing this really great series, and they're all online, reports about racial justice in Chicago. They've done some on Native Americans, they've done some on just the racial structure in general in the city. But one that they did a couple of years ago, and I encourage you to read, or I did a story on if you don't want to read a long story, about why. And one of the reasons, so where people are going, and Isabel Wilkerson, who wrote the wonderful book, Warmth of Other Suns, says, do not call this a reverse migration, because nothing will be on the scale of the Great Migration. And the people who tend to leave here are staying in the region. And Northwest Indiana is also a big place that they're relocating. So yes, there's some people who are going to Texas and going to Atlanta, but it is not in terms of scale, there is not a reverse migration happening of Black Chicagoans. But the UIC study does say that what they compiled is that the number one reason is that racial inequality and not feeling like there's opportunity in the city and that stretches across socioeconomic lines. So again, my trouble with the conversation is that it becomes very narrow and just a now, and people trying to look for quick answers, and it has to be looked at much more broadly, much more holistically. Someone asked why there are so few Black-owned banks in Chicago. So I will tell you a book that really changed, that I would call life-changing, I'll put it in the chat, was The Color of Money by Mirza Baradadan. And it's about Black banking in this country and how it would never really thrive because of segregation. So if you have a Black bank that has less access to capital from its people, from its homeowners, it's not going to be the same as other banks. So that is really the shorthand answer. They just weren't able to survive given the economic conditions, even if you did have home ownership. And then you have a cycle of Black homes being undervalued, and so mortgages are lower. And then, so yeah, it's a very layered issue, but the short answer is segregation is the reason why we don't have them. And ProPublica just did an amazing story on GN Bank, which is still Black owned, but a Ghanaian family bought it, and it was a Black owned bank that was started, I believe, in the 1930s. It was a savings and loan, and he really breaks down like what happened with this bank, and so that's a little bit of a proxy for, or a good example about the struggles that Black owned banks have. So we have hit the hour mark, but I can take a couple more questions if we have any more. Okay, we have one down in the front.
Could you comment on, this may be all political, but I find it very disturbing that so many school districts and even the state of Texas and Florida have not permitted construction of any part of the 1619 project, even though the Pulitzer Center has set up all these teaching tools for teachers. And it's just part of our American history. And I find it very disturbing that you would try to censor part of the historical story of America. Do you have any comments about that?
Yeah, Marilyn says she's concerned about school districts shutting down teaching of the 1619 project. You know, there's so much talk about cancel culture in this country, and it's really framed wrong. The true cancel culture is when you have school districts saying you can't teach certain things because they want to believe the lies that have been told, or the omissions of their own education. And, you know, to the gentleman's point earlier, people want to look at these as individual issues when teaching the history is not about that superintendent or that one school board member. It's not about making that person feel guilty or feel bad. There's this narrative about it's making white people, you're teaching people that whiteness is bad or that white people are bad. And that says more about how they are interpreting the work and probably not even engaged in the work. I can tell you that critical race theory is not being taught in schools because critical race theory is taught in law schools on a graduate level. There's no way, if your kid is being taught critical race theory, then they are beyond gifted and special and talented. And there's been journalism out there that has talked about I forgot the man's name, who decided to politicize this and make this a talking point. So kind of like how Planned Parenthood is shorthand for something, that's what CRT is becoming now. So, you know, that is the real cancel culture that we are seeing in this country, in the banning of books and the banning of teaching certain things. I saw one other comment about, and thank you for all the love in the chat. The biggest concern and complaint I hear from my Black colleagues and friends is that they are tired of educating Caucasians about all the history of race in this country. Particularly true during 2020. I believe it's incumbent on us to do our homework, participate in forums like this, and educate others. I thought that was I mean, there are lots of great comments, but just circling back to the point of, you know, talking to other white people and, you know, there really is, you know, some of my friends who cover race sometimes get tired of the question about, you know, well, what should I do as a white person? But Michael Eric Dyson wrote a book that is really for white people on what they can do next. And I think it is called, it has tears in the title. Let me see if I can. Tears We Cannot Stop, a sermon to white America, and it's written like a letter, it's written like a sermon to white people, so I recommend that book. $306. Yeah, that would, yeah. That's a bulk set for 25 copies. Yeah.
Well, we don't want to overextend our welcome to you. No, it's just been a fabulous day.
Thank you so much for having me, and thank you for your engagement in real life as well as online. Thank you.